So let's look again specifically at glucose regulation. I talked a little bit about it when I introduced our key players, but now we can see this negative feedback loop homeostatic mechanism through the diagram here. If we follow the left side, we're looking at what happens when you have low glucose, and this is in the case of people who do not have diabetes, so able-bodied people whose pancreases are working normally, that regulate this in this way. When you have diabetes, you have to regulate it in different ways, and we'll talk about that as well. If you have low blood glucose, your cells are hungry. You're probably going to feel hungry too, right? One way you get sugar in your blood is by eating some sugar. But let's say you can't right now for some reason. You're sitting in a class or in a meeting or in church and you can't go get lunch right now, or you've ordered your food at a restaurant but it's taking a long time to get there. So you have low blood glucose, and this sends a signal to your pancreas, which secretes a lot of digestive enzymes and digestive hormones. And your pancreas has different types of cells in there. The alpha cells are the ones that when they detect low blood sugar, they release glucagon. Now remember, glucagon is the one that takes that glycogen that's packaged on the liver as extra kind of reserve sugar, breaks down that glycogen into glucose. So then your liver helps release that glucose into the blood, and you have typical, normal blood sugar amounts circulating in your blood so that you can feed your cells. We also have a mechanism that's similar for high blood glucose. You have high blood sugar, your cells can't get to it right away, so insulin is released from the beta cells from your pancreas. And then your body cells, including your fat cells, take the glucose from your blood. And then you go back down to having normal blood glucose levels. In the case of people with diabetes, there's two types. So there's a couple different ways we could talk about how this mechanism might work differently. In type 1 diabetes, that's the one that children are more likely to be diagnosed with, although some adults are diagnosed with type 1 and some children are diagnosed with type 2. Type 1 is an autoimmune disease in which the alpha and beta cells are attacked by your own body. So your pancreas stops working. It's not able to do either of these. So when your blood glucose is low, you can't break down the glycogen from your liver. You're kind of just screwed. Your cells will starve. And so when you have a blood sugar low with type 1 diabetes, you may pass out. You may have seizures. You may die. It's pretty serious. So you need to fix it very quickly. This is why people with diabetes might often have candy around, or I knew one person who actually had a glucagon tablets, and there's glucagon injections so that you can break down the glucose that's on your liver. But getting sugar into your system quickly can help you bring it back up to normal and feed your cells, including your brain cells, so that you don't pass out or die. In, again, type 1 diabetes, you can also have high blood glucose. So you lose this ability to regulate it yourself because your pancreas is no longer working. You can't release insulin from your beta cells of your pancreas either. And so you may have to inject yourself with insulin. People with type 1 diabetes often wear a pump that they wear constantly they don't have to measure out the insulin and inject it themselves every time. The pump is going to do that for them consistently and help them achieve normal blood glucose levels. So in type 1, your blood glucose can go really sharply one way or the other, and that can be pretty dangerous. So we already talked about the dangers of low blood glucose. The dangers of high blood glucose could be stroke, for example. I had a great aunt who had extremely high blood glucose, and that led to her stroke that eventually led to her death. So type 1 diabetes you're not doing any of this allostatic or homeostatic mechanisms inside your body anymore. You're having to do it outside, sort of like being cold-blooded, I guess, when you have to actually go out into the sun to warm up, or you need to go crawl in a hole to cool down or something like that. You're having to regulate this all externally. So this is why people with type 1 diabetes can often benefit from service dogs because they can alert people and wake folks up in the night when the blood sugar might be low. So this tends to happen overnight in diabetes because you're fasting. Overnight while you're sleeping, that's several hours where you're not eating, and you normally don't go an 8 or 9 hour period during the day of not eating. What happens overnight is in a typical able-bodied person, you burn off that glycogen into glucose on your liver, and you can burn that fuel, and it keeps you from starving to death. But you could actually, it's like a quick form of starvation if you have a serious blood sugar load during the night. Now, in type 2 diabetes, this is not quite the same. Type 1 diabetes, again, is an autoimmune disease in which your pancreas cells get attacked. In type 2 diabetes, this is the one where your insulin doesn't work anymore when your body produces it because you've become resistant to it. So you've eaten a diet of very high glucose and high carbohydrates over a lifetime. And there is some genetic predisposition here, but it's a lifestyle disease for the most part. You've done this for so long that you've kind of gained a tolerance to it, just like you would a drug. So you gain a tolerance or a resistance to the amount of insulin that you have. There are drugs other than just taking insulin to help treat diabetes, type 2 diabetes when it's diagnosed early. But oftentimes people with type 2 will have to take insulin as well. So typically what they're having to do is just take higher and higher and higher levels of insulin than what their body would be producing because they have a tolerance to it, just like you would gain a tolerance to a drug and you would need to take more and more to get the same effect. So in the case of having high blood glucose, your cells can actually starve in a way that's sort of similar to having low blood glucose. So when your blood sugar's high, but you don't have insulin, you've got a bunch of sugar in your blood, but now your cells can't get it. So your cells will just be there starving and hungry. You could actually lose lots and lots of weight. So if you have always had a pretty high carbohydrate diet for most of your life, if you have anybody in your family with diabetes and you're having symptoms like excessive urination and excessive thirst and sudden unexplained weight loss, even though you haven't changed your diet or exercise or anything, seek medical advice because those are the symptoms of type 2 diabetes. So you will actually lose a lot of weight oftentimes because your cells are starving. You have all this sugar circulating in your blood, but because you don't have enough insulin or you've gotten this tolerance to insulin, your cells are not able to take in that glucose. All this sugar circulating in your blood creates a lot of complications. So this is why type 2 diabetes can lead to very serious problems like having to have parts of your body amputated. Infections can get out of control because pathogens like to eat this sugar just as much as you do and just as much as your body cells do. And so when your blood is just full of sugar all the time that's not being put into your cells and not being stored away properly, even the very small cuts or any kind of broken skin can get out of control very, very quickly. You also have the problem of diabetic neuropathy, which makes this even worse because your neurons going to your sensory neurons going to your feet and your tips of your fingers, for example, can begin to die off. So they can get kind of constricted and starved. And so you're more likely to hurt your feet if you can't feel them in the same way anymore. And so the tiniest of abrasions can be dangerous. You're more likely to hurt yourself because your sensation is going to be different. And then bacteria are just going to feed, bacteria and fungus as well are just going to feed on that sweet, sweet blood. So we're going to look a little bit at this cycle in another way and how it makes you feel and how people can get trapped in a cycle that's more likely to lead them to type 2 diabetes. Now, I don't want to do any shaming. If you have type 2 diabetes, you have an illness, you have a chronic illness, and I'm never here to blame anybody for their chronic illness, especially because a lot of high carbohydrate foods are cheaper, and a lot of us have learned to eat this way, and a lot of us might have been practically force-fed this way from the time we were young without a lot of choice in it. So, even though I've said that type 2 diabetes is a lifestyle disease, it is still a public health issue that needs to be addressed in a lot of other ways from the top down, and we don't need to be blaming people for their diseases.